everyone, and welcome to, week 2 of the Mars Hill Exchange. I'm so glad to be here with you, and really excited for the conversation we're going to have tonight. Just to introduce myself to you, if you don't know, my name is Paul Gould, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and also the director of a new master's in philosophy of religion that's officially starting in the fall. And then also kind of wearing another hat tonight as president of the Two Tasks Institute. For the next 4 weeks, we're doing this online series called the Mars Hill Exchange, where we're basically just looking to have a conversation about what does faithfulness to Christ look like in this day and age. And specifically for this month, what we're focusing on is the topic of cultural apologetics in the church. And what does it look like in the 21st century to have a fresh sort of encounter with culture so that people can actually see the goodness, the truth, and the beauty of Jesus and the gospel through the church and as the church. And so let me just tell you a little bit about how tonight is going to go, and then I'll introduce our guest. But basically for about 30 minutes, I'm going to turn it over to our guest, John Tyson, and he's going to speak to us on the topic of Jesus is better. And for, roughly 30 minutes, give or take. And then after that, for the rest of our time, we're going to do a question and answer time. And you can see on your webinar that we've got a question and answer box down on your bottom right-hand corner there. And so anytime as we begin, if you have a question, even if it's in the first few minutes, just go ahead and type it in there. And then I'll start, then I'll come back on after John's done. And we'll just have a conversation and we'll work through your questions, and I might have a few questions of my own. But that's it. So we'll keep it pretty informal that way tonight. And we're just really looking forward to having a conversation with you. Okay, so let me introduce to you our speaker for tonight. John, glad to see he's just popped on there. We've got John Tyson with us tonight, and I'm really excited about this. I've been getting to know John, I don't know, last couple months maybe. We've been chatting about things related to the topic that we'll be talking about tonight. And John is, he's a pastor, he's a church planter, he's from Australia, but you've been in New York, I guess, for a couple of decades now, right? Or you've been in the States for a couple of decades.
Yes, I've been in the US for 24 years.
24 years, okay, that's awesome. Well, and now he resides in Manhattan in New York. And so, John is a pastor, church planter, is an author of a number of books, including Sacred Roots, A Creative Minority, The Burden is Light, and Beautiful Resistance, as well as lots of other resources that you can access online. He's got videos that you can watch as a church or a small group, and lots of different things there. And like I said, he lives in Manhattan with his wife and his 2 children, and then serves as a lead pastor of the church called in New York City there. And you can learn more about that through the link on our website. So I'm going to turn it over to John. John, we're really excited to have you here with us. So thanks so much for being here, and welcome to the Mars Hill Exchange.
No worries, mate. Thanks so much for allowing me to speak and to present. And I'm grateful for the time. And for all of you who are tuning in, I'm not sure which part of the country you're joining us from, if you're all down there in Florida or whatever, but I'm really, really honored that you would invest the time tonight to talk about this discussion, Jesus is better. So what I do vocationally is I pastor a church. Over 80% of our church is people in their 20s, and a lot of them are newer to faith or returning to faith. And in a recent afternoon, sitting outside of a coffee shop on 45th Street in New York City, I got together and had coffee with a young man who had become a Christian in our church. But after the excitement and the joy and all of that had worn off, he was really struggling with his faith. And he felt crippled by doubt, and he was getting resistance for his faith. And so we got together, and then he eventually asked me this question. He says to me, "How do you do it?" I'm like, "Do what?" It's like, "How do you remain a pastor?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, the more I find out about our faith, the more I realize that the church has been complicit in Christian nationalism. It's been riddled with hypocrisy. It feels like we've sold our soul to politics. There's a lot of apathy and materialism inside the church. There's historic stuff, the Inquisition, the Crusades. I'm reading the whole Bible. I don't know if you're aware of this. It's filled with problem passages Like there's a lot of stuff going on in the Bible. Why and how do you do it? How do you remain faithful to Jesus? And a lot of times pastors can just, shoot their mouth off and they can have pre-canned responses. But I just sat there and I sort of took that in. How do I do it? Why do I do it? Why Jesus? How can we really make the claim that Jesus is better? In a pluralistic society like ours, this can seem like an arrogant claim. It can seem like an intolerant claim. Who are we to say that Jesus is better? Better than who? Better than what? Well, I want to say Jesus, off the bat, Jesus is better than nihilism and the fruit that it's born in our society. I think Jesus is better than secular humanism and its solutions that it puts forth in the world. I think Jesus is better than consumerism. He's better than just taking a bunch of stuff in and thinking that's going to fix the deep void in our souls and the brokenness of our world. Is Jesus better than other religions? Is Jesus better than other philosophies and people's opinions? So I really sat with that. Yes, off the bat, I can say Jesus is better than many things, but is he better than everything? And so this really made me pause being pushed in my faith like this. And it made me come back and say, why is it that in humility, I want to put forth that Jesus is better? So I've got three very, very simple reasons, but I feel like they address some of the core longings of the human heart and perhaps even our own experiences as we wrestle with these sorts of things. So why is Jesus better? So the first thing I want to say is this. I think Jesus is better because of the way that Jesus sees the world. The way that Jesus sees the world. You can tell a lot about a religion or a philosophy according to what it pays attention to. So, for example, if you were to read the scriptures, the Pharisees paid attention to the minute observance of the law. But it's an important question to ask us, what does God pay attention to? What does God pay attention to? So Christians are making this claim that Jesus is God in the flesh, and that as we read the gospel accounts, we in some sense are finding out what matters to God. What we pay attention to shows us a lot about what we value. And one of the most amazing things about what God pays attention to is what he frames as important. What he frames as important. I read quite a bit of Buechner over the last couple of years, and he had this quote, and it was one of those stop you in the track sort of quotes. This is what he says. Art is saying stop. It helps us to stop by putting a frame around something and makes us see it in a way we would never have seen it under the normal circumstances of living. As so many of us do, on sort of an automatic pilot going through the world without really seeing much of anything. So here's his key insight. What the gift that art does is it takes something that is ordinary and overlooked, but by framing it and putting it in a gallery setting, it demands our attention. So this to me becomes fascinating, because if this is what we learn about God, what he pays attention to, the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is being framed in the Gospels? Now, I want to say this. What does the world frame? What does the world say? Stop, pay attention to this. And when you look at the world, here's what you see. It pays attention to the rich. It pays attention to the beautiful. It pays attention to the powerful. It pays attention to the spectacular. But when you read the Gospels, what does God frame? The Gospel frames outsiders, the overlooked, those who were vulnerable, the poor, the broken. One of the things that's so remarkable about the gospel accounts is it tells us what God pays attention to. Jesus in the Gospels had time to stop everything to simply bless children. Jesus paid attention to a woman at a well. Jesus paid attention to a woman, a widow, putting in a small mite while everybody else was putting in large gifts. We tend to love the beautiful. We tend to love the rich. We tend to love the powerful like the world, even inside the church tradition at times. But you see, God goes below the surface and sees things that we don't see. And really, when I read the Gospels, this is what makes Jesus better than almost anybody or anything else, the way he viewed the world. Jesus' capacity to frame the moment shows us that God cares about the things that matter to our hearts. our brokenness, our pain, the fact that we are often the other or excluded or overlooked. I think one beautiful example of this is from a book by Philip Yancey. He tells a story about finding God in unexpected places. So Philip Yancey is over in Nepal, and his wife is a physical therapist. And so they go to do a tour of a place called the Green Pastures Hospital. And they basically specialize in leprosy rehabilitation. And he says, as they're walking along the outdoor corridor in one of the courtyards, he said he noticed one of the ugliest human beings he had ever seen. This woman, this creature's hands were bandaged in gauze. She had deformed stumps where most people had feet. Her face showed the worst ravages of leprosy. Her nose had sort of shrunken away so that if you looked right at her, you could see straight into her sinus cavities. Her eyes were covered with callus. She was blind, totally blind. She had scar-covered patches of skin all over her arms. And he remembers seeing her and just immediately being physically repulsed by her. And after he goes on, they get a tour of the hospital unit. And as they come around to the place where they started, he said this creature had sort of crawled across the courtyard to the very edge of the walkway, pulling herself along the ground by planting her elbows and dragging her body like a wounded animal. And he said, I was ashamed at first. I thought, oh, here's a beggar in a leprosy collar who just wants my money. But his wife, who saw a little bit differently, had a much more holy reaction. Without hesitation, while he's standing there judging this person, his wife bends down and puts his arm around the woman. And then this old woman, this leper, rests her head against his wife's shoulder and begins to sing a song in Nepali, a tune that everybody immediately recognized. And that was the tune, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And then the lady who's running the hospital says this, Dan Meyer is one of our most devoted church members, she told us. Most of the patients here are Hindus, but we have a little Christian chapel, and Dan Meyer comes every time the door is open. She's a prayer warrior. She loves to greet and welcome every visitor who comes to the Green Pastures. And no doubt she heard us talking, and she walked along the corridor. And he said, a few months later, we heard that Dan Meyer had died. And so he writes this, close to my desk, I keep a photo that I snapped just as she was singing to Janet. Whenever I feel polluted by the beauty-obsessed celebrity culture I live in, a culture in which people pay exorbitant sums to shorten their noses or plump up their breasts to achieve some impossible ideal of beauty, while 9,000 people die each day from AIDS for lack of treatment, and hospitals like Green Pastures scrape by in charity crumbs, I pull out that photo. I see two beautiful women, my wife smiling sweetly, wearing a brightly colored Nepali outfit she bought the day before, holding in her arms an old crone who would flunk any beauty test ever devised, except the one that matters most. Out of that deformed, hollow shell of a body, the light of God's presence shines out. The Holy Spirit had found a home. Now, the Gospels say this, or this actually 2 Corinthians says this, from now on, we view no one from an earthly point of view. What a statement. We no longer look at people and mark them out by their cultural categories. Why? Because Jesus never did. Jesus framed in the middle of the human story the broken and the outcast, and he viewed them not as rejects, but as image bearers of God, worthy of love, worthy of honor, and worthy of attention. And if you were to ask me, why is Jesus better? I think Jesus is better because of the way he shows us what God pays attention to, the way Jesus saw the world. The second reason that I think Jesus is beautiful and compelling is that Jesus has a very, very rare capacity to bring beauty out of brokenness, to bring restoration in the midst of the ruin that we experience in our world. We are a society right now groaning and aching for some sort of restoration in the midst of our brokenness. Even today, there's protests in Minnesota. So if you go to the New York Times website, on the top, you've got the trial of George Floyd, and the next biggest article is about another unarmed young black man who was shot and killed by the police. So you're watching the story of one killing while a next one is already teed up. Just feels like there's so much brokenness in our culture. Well, what's going to fix things? Well, sometimes people view religion as what's fundamentally wrong with society. And so they think the world will get better and it will repair itself if we keep religion out of things. But what is really going to heal our world today? Is it going to be a political solution? I think that politics certainly has a place. But look at the mess politics is serving us up in our world right now. I don't think politics is going to heal our nation and bring beauty out of the broken mess we're in. Well, maybe it's science. Is science going to bring beauty out of brokenness? Well, science is helpful, but obviously has limits. And no matter if we vaccinate everybody and we find a way to end this pandemic, we're not going to be able to deal with the trauma of the human heart. Questions like death, questions like loneliness and isolation. I don't think it's going to be an economic solution that's going to bring beauty out of brokenness, no matter how much money. And the US government right now is printing money like it's monopoly money. I don't think it's going to be economics that's going to fix everything. I don't think it's going to be technology. How do we move forward? And so to me, this is fascinating because Jesus' fundamental mission in the world is his claim that he is here to repair the world. In Luke 4, Jesus has this famous passage. It's one that we are all familiar with, but it's his manifesto. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, to release from darkness for the prisoners, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then what's so amazing is that Jesus puts this forward as his manifesto, and then Jesus spends the rest of his ministry living this out. Jesus has the ability to step into the brokenness of the world and somehow to bring beauty and restoration out of it. Now, one of the things people ask me all the time as a pastor in New York City is like, what do you do for fun? Like, how do you keep your heart alive? Now, one of the things that has happened since I've moved to New York is I've fallen in love with jazz music. Now, if you don't like jazz music, it's because you haven't heard enough of it or because you need forgiveness. And so I forgive you for not liking jazz. But I want to tell you, there's nothing like jazz music as far as I'm concerned. When in 2005, we used to live next to a tiny little jazz club in the Upper West Side called Smoke. And I remember walking past it one night with my wife and just this transcendent sound leaking out of the building. And it was a summer night and just sort of like capturing my senses. And I was like, what is that? And then I stuck my head in and I was like, oh, that's what jazz is. So I've loved jazz. We love going to jazz clubs, and New York has a very, very rich jazz history. And one of the things I love about jazz, unlike in classical music, which is played from, like very, very formal, and it's all about execution of prescribed music, jazz sometimes flows from the heart. Now, there's a story about jazz in New York City that was told by a journalist for The Atlantic. And one of the things that people often do in New York City is they just go and see the house band. And so in New York City, Wynton Marsalis is one of the most famous musicians, is a remarkable musician, but he leads jazz at Lincoln Center. He's put out several artists, and he's actually a New York City legend. And I've seen him play before. It's just like, it just blows your mind. Well, he's playing in the journalist for The Atlantic is down at the Village Vanguard, and he's just taking one of those like easy nights off, so he's like, you know what, I don't know who's playing tonight, let me see the house band. And he goes into the house band, and he's sitting there and he's thinking to himself, this band is good. I mean, this band is incredibly good. And he's sitting there just like taking it all in. And he's sort of 4 songs into it when the guy on the trumpet steps forward into the light for a second, and he has this realization. He says, oh my gosh, This is the incomparable Wynton Marsalis, and he's doing an underground, undercover set here, pretending he's a part of the house band. He goes, I just can't believe this. And so he's sitting, and no one else knows what's happening. So he's just sitting back, and he's like, I'm about to witness jazz mastery. Now, 4 songs in, Wynton is playing a ballad, and the ballad is, I don't stand a ghost of a chance with you. And then right at the height, and you go ahead, go get yourself some Spotify on that song. I don't stand a ghost of a chance with you. He is playing transcendent, beautiful with all of his heart. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, someone's cell phone goes off. And I was like, oh my gosh, are we still living in a world where people don't know what vibrate is? So the cell phone goes off. But it gets worse. The guy stands up and takes the call. And so he takes the call and he slowly walks out. And the journalist writes in his notepad, magic ruined. And the audience just goes back to talking one another. Everything's been wrecked in the room. And Wynton is frozen on stage and he doesn't know what to do. Well, after a moment or two, he begins to play note for note the ringtone of the cell phone. And then the audience is like, what? Did the phone ring again? And they realize it's been played from the front by the band. And so they begin to laugh and begin to chuckle. And so he begins to sort of improvise and develop it out a little bit. And then the journalist says this, he repeated the cell phone tune and began to improvise with variations on the tune. The audience slowly came back to him. In a few minutes, he resolved the improvisation, which included keys once or twice and changed keys once or twice, throttled down to a ballad tempo, and ended up exactly where he had left off. And it says when he finished the song, the ovation was tremendous. And I love this analogy because it's a beautiful picture of, in spite of the magic being ruined in the midst of a beautiful performance, it shows that a master can weave even the discordant, interrupted notes of brokenness and despair back into a melody of grace and finish the work of redemption he started from the beginning. Romans 8 says this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And I love this because most of us are trying to make sense of the brokenness in our own stories, the magic that has been ruined in our hearts, our lives, our families, and our communities. And the question is it over? Is this it? But no, Jesus has the capacity to weave what was broken back into something beautiful. And this is really the stories, again, of the Gospels. Jesus is able to take the demoniac whose life is riddled with brokenness and to give him a story of full redemption, seated in his right mind at Jesus' feet. Or Mary Magdalene, we've just celebrated Easter. This is a woman who had 7 demons in her. I want you to meet that. Have you ever met a demon-possessed person? I saw one in a restaurant yesterday. Had to call the police on her. Completely overpowered with demonic forces. And yet, Mary Magdalene, when she's delivered by Jesus, is the first witness of the resurrection. She's the apostle to the apostles. Full restoration of a story that's been broken. Or you look at the story of Peter, someone who denied Jesus, and yet Jesus comes and brings him home again. When I look through the history of the human race, I just don't see anybody who not only sees people differently like Jesus does, but who has the power to bring beauty out of the brokenness of their story like a true master. Now, this is still happening, even in New York. I've passed it all the way through this pandemic in the middle of New York City, and it's been honestly one of the hardest things ever, particularly in the early days. My wife and I both got COVID. My wife was tremendously sick, in bed for over a month, thought she was going to die. The whole church was in complete and utter trauma. People, the sirens were 24 hours a day, and you just knew it was person after person being carried to the hospital. Hard to articulate the level of just heartache and angst. And so the city just felt like it had this cloud over it. And the church that I pastor, our offices are on 45th and 9th, which is where I have lived for the last 6 years, 2 blocks from Times Square. And the neighborhood was just decimated. It's just horrific and heartbroken. There's just like a cloud of heartache in the middle of the city. But believe it or not, in the midst of all of that brokenness, we just started sharing the good news of what Jesus had done for people in our city like we never had before. And slowly but surely, in an almost remarkable way, I don't know, it's because young people were confronted with death for the first time, up close and visceral, that they began to contemplate the mortality. I don't know if it's because people lost their jobs and their dreams all sort of fell apart. And they realized the fragility and the futility of worldly ambition. I don't know what it was, but people were open to looking for meaning and redemption in the midst of the brokenness. And so we saw in 2020, many people give their lives to Jesus for the first time. And so one of the things that Jesus tells us to do is to baptize people. But we don't own a church building. We didn't know where we were going to do this. People were socially distancing. And so we found a parking lot in the Salvation Army on 48th Street in the middle of Manhattan. And the street was just sort of, the night we did it, just you could feel the despondency and the heartache just hanging over the street like a cloud. It was quiet and it was dark. But here we are. We set up a little tent. That's a little kiddie pool right there. And that's a little summer, started to rain. That's a little summer tent we put over the top of it. But even in the midst of all of the brokenness, one by one, people stood up and talked about how God had redeemed what they had been through in the midst of 2020 and had used it to reweave a tapestry of God's goodness in the midst of the cultural brokenness. And people just began to share this story, this girl's story right here, this woman's story. This is a story of redemption just from heartache and failed relationships and promiscuity, but how in meeting Jesus, her life had been completely transformed. And this is her coming out in the middle of a very, very quiet and depressed street, but over in the corner, there's cheering and there's shouting and there's people coming out of a kiddie pool bursting with new life because Jesus has brought beauty to their life. One of my favorite pictures, this young guy, total atheist, no church background whatsoever, realized he couldn't earn his way into heaven, eventually surrendered to Jesus. And I love this. One of his friends gave him these. And this is almost like the Statue of Liberty. The smiles, the laughter, the tears, the joy in the midst of a broken city. Here's another story of a friend of mine named Olivia who grew up with very, very challenging circumstances, but had her life transformed by Jesus, person after person, standing up and testifying that even though the magic of their story had been ruined by sin, God was able to reweave something beautiful out of the midst of it. And this to me is why Jesus is better. Jesus is better than brokenness. Jesus is better than sin. Jesus is better than the cultural conditions around us. He has the capacity to renew our hearts. It's not just that Jesus sees the world differently. It's that Jesus saves the world differently. He brings beauty out of brokenness. And then lastly, I would say this, like, why is Jesus better? I think Jesus is better because of his grace. Because of his grace. Famous story about C.S. Lewis walking to a room where philosophers had been debating about what separated Christianity from all the other religions, and they had heated debates. Was it about its ethical vision? Was it the Sermon on the Mount? Was it the teachings of Christ? Was it the weaving together of the old and new covenants and all the rest of it? And they can't come to any sort of consensus. C.S. Lewis walks in and says, "What's the question here?" And he says, "Oh, that answer's easy. It's grace." And he walks out of the room. Grace is an extraordinary thing. You see, most religions say that our response to the brokenness of the world is that we have to make up for it through our own efforts. We have to atone ourselves for what we've done wrong and what the world has done wrong. But if you've ever been trying to be good for even a day, you realize how hard that is. I tell people, I can't even eat healthy for a week, let alone atone for my sins or multi-generation brokenness that's happened. I can't even put the right food in my body for a week. Again, C.S. Lewis says, nobody knows how hard it is to be good until they've tried to be good. When you don't care how you live, it's easy. But the second you try to be good, you realize it's impossible. We need God's grace. And here's what grace says. Grace says, God will come and rescue you and bring you home. You don't have to earn your way back in. And I think we fundamentally forget that. And this is what Jesus brings. You see, Jesus' teachings, and there's many ways that Jesus could have described those who had fallen away from God or had failed in their goodness. But Jesus uses this term the most. It's the term lost. Jesus says, for the Son of Man came to seek and save that which is lost. Now, I love this because lost implies, you ever been lost, by the way? Many of you are a generation that has never known the absolute horror of driving around without a cell phone and relying on a map, where you literally had to pull out paper and try and make sense. So almost like cave paintings, but on paper, try and make sense of the landscape and the objects and drive around. I used to get lost all the time before I had Google Maps. And it's terrible because there's a place you're meant to be and there's somewhere you're trying to get, but you do not know how to get there yourself. And Jesus says, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. And so to me, this is so fascinating about the salvation Jesus offers as compared to all other secular schemers or religious salvations, is because you find God not telling people to get out of their sin and brokenness themselves, but him coming to save them, meet them in the midst of it. You see, there's this idea of the redemptive edge, which basically says that where you find Jesus is at the absolute center of the broken, and he's fighting for its redemption. So I want to give you sort of a continuum to think about how people often view religion compared to the beauty of Jesus' grace. A lot of people think that the purpose of religion is to basically make people comfortable. And as long as you're sort of like nice and good and politically correct, people never bother with you. But if you take this stuff seriously, people start to get a little bit cautious about what it is that you believe. If you take that caution to another level, people will move to downright concern about you. And if you follow that track even further, people will begin to criticize you as a fanatic, because what comes next is just basically a place of total darkness. But here's what I want you to see. When you actually look at the ministry of Jesus, this is where Jesus' ministry happened. It happened at a place of criticism and darkness, and people hated him. Leslie Newbegin says this: I think the deepest motive for mission is simply the desire to be with Jesus where he is, on the frontier between the reign of God and the usurped dominion of the devil. Now, this is quite an extraordinary claim, because it says that Jesus is not passively waiting for people to get right with God, but where he is on the frontier, that point of beauty and brokenness, and Jesus is bringing people home. So I want you to think about Jesus' ministry. You can compare him to any other religious leader or philosopher. Look at Jesus' ministry. At the place of criticism, Jesus is eating with sinners, and he's criticized for this. Jesus spends time with women. This was a scandal in his day. Jesus breaks the rules and religious formalities of his day, particularly the Sabbath violations and those connected to healing. Jesus has sketchy disciples. Judas betrays him. Peter denies him. The rest of them run away. And yet Jesus still loves them. Jesus defends and creates a space between the woman caught in adultery and the accuser, and he's criticized for it. And then Jesus does something extraordinary in the first century. He fails to honor the patriarchy and paterfamilias by basically saying, my family are the people who are loyal to me. And then you look at where Jesus' ministry happened. He didn't spend his time enjoying the company of the Pharisees on the regular. No, he spent his time in Samaria. This was a place of scandal where Jews did not go. Jesus spent time with a demoniac, somebody who was chained up and separated from the rest of society because he was unfit to participate in the larger social contracts and community of his day. Jesus goes over to the Decapolis, which was a place that the Jews traditionally avoided. It was the place they believed the prodigal son ran away to. And yet here is Jesus, unashamed to cross the boundaries that the Jewish leaders had put in place of respectable society. Jesus goes and eats with Zacchaeus. He's a cultural traitor in his day. And he does this in Jericho, which was basically like the Hamptons of the city of Jerusalem, where all the rich went to have their second summer homes. Jesus goes and finds the chief tax collector and spends time with him. Then Jesus sends us on the Great Commission, not just to comfort one another and reaffirm our godliness, but to go to the ends of the earth to find those who are lost. And then the whole book of Acts is basically the account of the gospel going further and further away to those who need it most, but can't get there on their own. And so when you look at the ministry of Jesus, sorry, I have a pet chihuahua who I have no control over, and he just barks at will. So Jesus' ministry was defined in criticism and darkness. And I want you to see this. Almost none, barely any of Jesus' ministry happens in a place of comfort and caution. And you want to know why? Because Jesus' ministry is about manifesting grace to the people who can't find it and don't deserve it. And to me, this is such a distinctive from all of the other philosophies and cultures of our world. And so if you were to ask me today, how is Jesus better? I think Jesus is better. I put this humbly. I think Jesus is better because of what he pays attention to. Nobody saw like Jesus saw, claiming to be God. I think Jesus is better because he has the power to bring beauty out of brokenness, and history is filled with those lives that have been transformed by his goodness. I think Jesus is better because he offers grace in a culture that is worn out and exhausted of trying to save itself. And he just simply says, come to me, I've done this for you. So I close with this quote from Brennan Manning. By entering human history, God has demolished all previous conceptions of who God is and what man is supposed to be. We are suddenly presented with a God who suffers crucifixion. This is not the God of the philosophers who speak with cool detachment about the supreme being. A supreme being would never allow spit on his face. Jesus Christ has irreparably changed the world. When preached purely, his word exalts, frightens, shocks, and forces us to reassess our whole life. The gospel breaks our train of thought, shatters our comfortable piety, and cracks open our capsule truths. The flashing spirit of Jesus Christ breaks new paths everywhere. His sentences stand like quivering swords of flame because he did not come to bring peace but a revolution. The gospel is not a children's fairy tale, but rather a cutting-edge, rolling thunder, convulsive earthquake in the world of the human spirit. And for that reason, I would humbly submit to you tonight, that is the reason that Jesus is better. Okay, thanks, mate. I think we're going to jump into some questions now.
All right. Wow. Thank you so much, John. That was really, really great. And I loved all the content and the 3 points that you made. And so now this is our chance to have a little conversation with John. And so if you have questions, I'll start it off, but I want you to go ahead and type those questions in the Q&A box there on the bottom of your screen. I'd love to have a conversation. I know John would too, with the things that are stirring in your heart as you listen to that. Okay, John, so let me just start with I've actually got a couple things that are stirring in my heart as I think about what you shared, but let me just start with the way you framed that, about the way you framed Jesus was very attractive and beautiful. And so I'm wondering, maybe just to get us sort of started, how does a complicit church that often obscures this vision of who Jesus is, how do we sort of live according to this story that you're suggesting? What are some steps that we can take, because we're not there?
Well, I honestly think like one of the things we have to do is we have to reacquaint ourselves with the person of Jesus. Like it often amazes me how little actual time Christians spend in the Gospels. So if I was to ask everybody who claims to be a follower of Jesus, okay, so your life and vision is to be shaped by the life of this man. How much time have you spent with him? And I'm not, and it just blows my mind. People are like, well, I read like 4 chapters of Mark's gospel. And it's like, you will not pass a college introductory level class by reading 4 verses of something occasionally. And I think that we've actually just lost sight and connection with Jesus. I'm telling you, every time I read the Gospels, I feel like they're still adding to it. It's like, I've never seen that verse in my life. I've never seen that word. I've never seen that response. And we always have to let Jesus confront our biases by encountering him in the text. I think that's the first thing. Then probably, Jesus came not just as, like, he definitely was the Messiah, but Jesus came as a part of a prophetic tradition. And, part of the prophetic tradition was to critique the people of God. And Jesus does this in Matthew's gospel. I believe it's Matthew 23, when he critiques the Pharisees. He has 7 woes to the Pharisees. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. He calls them whitewashed tombs. He calls them sons of hell. He says that when you cross land and sea to make a single convert, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. How offensive is this? This is so offensive. But Jesus is basically saying, you have taken the traditions of man and the way you practice this religion, and you've distorted it so it's unrecognizable, and it's actually damaging. Paul does the same thing in 1 Corinthians 11. He says, your gatherings do more harm than good. And it's basically because they're not repenting and taking a deep internal look at how they're practicing their faith. So again, we understand what God's called us to do in repentance. We sort of are aware of the ways that it's been distorted. And then we try and embody the alternative through like thoughtful and humble practice. And then read the lives of the saints. Read the lives of the saints. The saints who just mess you up. They are those who will the one thing, and they just remind us that another life is possible.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, great. We've got some questions coming. Go ahead and keep writing them up there. I'm going to ask one more of John, and then I'm going to switch to some of the questions that our listeners are asking. I love that chart that you did with the from caution to comfort, or comfort to caution, and all the way to Jesus's ministry. That was a really striking visual that was super helpful to connect some dots with just struggling with the church in America right now. Would you say, like, it's so interesting where you said that Jesus's ministry, I don't know if you can access that, pretty quickly on your thing, but like Jesus's ministry is all the way over on the right, with the criticism
Yes.
and I wonder, much of us, the American church, whatever, we're probably are on the left side, right? Comfort, maybe just comfort. How do we, I don't know. So I don't even know what my question is, but this is just such an illuminating, this graphic here.
Yes.
We're kind of to the left of this. Is this part of our problem? And we need to, like, Jesus would walk into many of our churches and we would be offended or pushed, or I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on where we are and how we get out of this rut?
Yeah, I think you've got to choose to do this every day. One small risky act of obedience every day. And so, it depends on where you live. Sometimes it's I face 2 challenges, which means it's a little bit easier for me to do this every day. And yet it's a little easier for my heart to become cold because I see it every day. So one of my goals is like, I want, and this right here, I call this stuff like very, very sophisticated. I just call this the Jesus stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just want to do the Jesus stuff. It's possible to spend a lifetime in church programs and never actually get to the Jesus stuff, reaching the lost, helping those who are broken, that sort of thing. So I want to have like some Jesus stuff every day. And sometimes it means I take a little bit longer. Sometimes it means like asking the Holy Spirit for ways to creatively love people in my context. But I think you got to move in this direction. This is about money. This is about lifestyle. It's about location. It's about intentionality. And so the big point is this. If you follow the typical American church, you will not drift into the Jesus stuff. You will drift into a place of comfort. So you have to, which my last book was called Beautiful Resistance. You got to resist this stuff, but you got to do it beautifully, not self-righteously.
Very good. Okay, great. So here's a question. So the racial injustice and behaviors of Christians this year has caused some folks to talk about deconstructing their faith. In fact, we just heard another prominent Christian intellectual that walked away from his faith yesterday or this week.
Who was that?
A guy named Paul Maxwell. So more in some academic areas.
Really?
Yeah. So this is fairly common. But the question here is, how do I help believers who are disenchanted with the church stay in love with Jesus, even though they are weary of his bride? That's a great question.
Yeah. Well, I just like in here. we do have to acknowledge that this is sort of a year of reckoning, that God in his sovereignty has utilized the horrific death, particularly of George Floyd, was the one that sort of shook everything, to sort of like wake up and to trouble the stated cultural narrative of the United States, which is often presented with tremendous American exceptionalism. And look, America's great. I'm here by choice. Most of you were born here. So, I like America, but it's just another country. It's not the kingdom of God. God doesn't have a special covenant with America that I can see biblically it's bad prophecy. It's a bad 80s prophecy chart from the book of Daniel that says America's in the Bible. And so, but Americans somehow seem to believe that. And so they're constantly mapping and overlooking their sins because of some elements of the religious founding. So number one, the traditional American narrative has been shaken. I'm trying to discern what to do with the word wrath. How do you handle? Oh no, sorry, that's a different one. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong question. That's why it's gone. It's back. Okay. So what do we do? So here's what I would say. Neil Postman, in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, has a fascinating concept, and I think this is a part of the solution. He says this: culture has made us liars, which means we have a low information to action ratio. Okay. This is what it means. We know everything about that which we can do nothing about. And then when it comes to what we can do everything about, we know almost nothing about it. So for example, how many of you know every neighbor's name on your street where you live? How many of you know the deep cries of the heart, the pains and struggles that they have? Your capacity to literally love your neighbor is at 100%. You have agency, you have proximity, you have so many things that would enable you to literally be the hands and feet of Jesus, yet most of us don't even know our neighbors' names, let alone love our neighbors, okay? Yeah, you know about viral rates out of Wuhan, China. You can do almost nothing about the city of Wuhan, but you know everything about it. You know the hospitals that broke out from. So my point is, we're living in a culture that is not matching information to agency, and Christians often fall into this trap. So my response is, you have to personally make sure that you are the alternative to the thing that you're critiquing. It's very, very easy to push off into the distance rather than to embody locally. It's a lot harder to embody locally. So I think it's important to make statements of solidarity. I made one tonight on Twitter. I think it's important to let people know, hey, we see what you're going through and we stand with you. But if you don't work on the structures of your life, embodying something different and more compelling personally, you won't have the moral authority and your critique will ring hollow eventually. So to me, it is making sure that, people talk particularly about race, about doing the work. I think it's important that you do that work and that you build in a beautiful, compelling alternative, local multi-ethnic community that embodies the alternatives. And that to me is the place to start. Inside the church, working on those issues, and then slowly move out as God calls us to do that. There's lots of smaller practical steps, but I think that's a big thing to me. There's also something about deconstruction. And I was going to say that, there is two kinds of deconstruction. There's godly deconstruction, Jesus deconstructing the religion of the Pharisees, for example. And here's what the Pharisees were doing wrong, by the way. I actually have tremendous sympathy for the Pharisees, because the Pharisees everyone was trying to answer the question, why are the freaking Romans here? Like they'd had the Maccabean revolt. They were under their own rule and reign. They had a window of freedom and self-governance in the Holy Land. And they believe, yes, the conditions are right for the Messiah. And then the Romans come in basically and just run over. And they're like, where did we go wrong? God promised that we'd be the head, not the tail. We violated the covenant. So they go back into the book of Deuteronomy and say, where did we go wrong? And they go, aha, we haven't been holy and observant enough. So what the Pharisees do that's so unique, you think about this temptation, they take the extra set of commandments given to the priests while serving in the temple, and they take those temple holiness requirements and project it onto the typical person. And their vision is, if regular holiness is not working, let's get temple holiness. And their vision is to turn every table into a temple in every home in Israel. Then if we're holy, the Messiah will see that we have obeyed his word and we've clung to his commandments, and he'll come back. But what happened in their efforts was legalism came in. And as a result, it became about the traditions of men. Even though they had a good heart, they got so far away from the heart of the Torah. And so Jesus had to deconstruct the layers they put on top of it to get to the heart of the truth. And it is very possible that much of the deconstruction today is a godly deconstruction of human tradition. There is a deconstruction we have to be careful of, and that is just like the deconstruction of cynicism, which basically says you can't know anything and the whole thing's a lie. I'm sympathetic towards that. I've wrestled plenty with doubt and my faith over the years, but I honestly believe that ultimately you have to come out of deconstruction or it leads to nihilism. It really leads to joy. But that's just my perspective.
That's good. Okay, that's great. Okay, so question about, yes, Jesus is better, but how do you handle the trouble passages that you mentioned? I assume about God's wrath, there are still echoes of hell and judgment coming from God. How are we to understand those as beautiful?
Well, they're beautiful in a different sense. They're not aesthetically beautiful. They're not emotionally beautiful, but they hold a sort of a restorative justice sort of beauty that I think we are aching for too. So you have to talk about, so the New Testament, there's several different Greek words that talk about wrath. Romans 1, which looks like our sort of like heaviest, morose, somber passage about wrath. The word that's used there is actually God's passive wrath. So that, it is basically when you don't acknowledge that there's a God or give him thanks, what you end up with is self-definition and entitlement. And a society defined by self-definition and entitlement basically cannibalizes and destroys itself. And you see that progression in Romans chapter 1. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Paul says to Timothy, in the last days, there will be terrible times. And he starts with, people will be lovers of themselves. And that selfishness, self-love leads is sort of like a root sin that leads to all these other dysfunctions here. So God basically, we actually want wrath. We actually want God to step in and to execute justice at some level. Because it's a beautiful thing when justice is done and the guilty and people are held accountable for their sin. It's actually a beautiful thing. Right now, what are people hoping with George Floyd? Why can't we just say, well, he's sorry, we should let him off? He didn't mean to kill George. Like, he really regrets that now. So he could just go free. You go, no, are you kidding me? We're going to burn America down if that happens. Why? The outrage at the injustice. If justice is given, people will have a deep sense of, at last, things have been made right. That's the way that it should be happening. And so that's ultimately what God's wrath is. It's a form of his justice breaking into the world. The beauty of the Christian tradition, it says that God has a way, because of the cross, to execute justice and mercy, which means the wrath of God that we deserve is put on Jesus in our place, and instead we receive mercy. And when you receive mercy, when you know you should receive wrath, it produces a kind of humility that actually leads to cultural healing.
Yeah, and there's a kind of beauty in that too. Yeah. So yeah, good. Okay, great. This is another a great question here from someone. So I'm an older person who lives comfortably in the suburbs. How I also have limited energy due to health reasons. So the question is, how can I be better at reaching out to others with the love of Jesus? That's a great question.
Yeah, look, I would say, just love whoever God puts in front of you. That's all you're responsible for. If these are the circumstances you find yourselves in, just love whoever is in front of you. You have no idea who and how and what small acts of potent love will do over the course of time. You just never know. And so if you have people helping you, I would treat them like Christ. If you can do small things, if Mother Teresa says small things with great love, I would start there. So I wouldn't feel guilty. I would embrace your limits and try and love well and live with more intentionality connected to that. Secondly, you can pray. Many, many things happen in the world by people who have physical and health restrictions who give themselves to prayer. And Jesus says, what you do in secret will be rewarded in public. There'll be fruit that happens in our culture because of the hidden prayers that you pray. And so I think those are the two things. Like, love whoever God puts in front of you without guilt and intentionality. And secondly, commit yourself to prayer. Let me tell you, you can shape the world through prayer from any house on any street in the suburbs of America. You can touch the world and you can love. People often are tremendously lonely, have incredible relational needs in the suburbs. And by striking up a conversation or asking, how are you doing? You never know the kind of ministry you can have in someone's life who may look like they're doing fine.
That's really great. Okay, so I've got a question, and we've got a couple more minutes. So if you've got another question, feel free to type it in as well. So going back to your first reason here about, Jesus sees the world. Jesus is better because of how he sees the world. Can you say a little bit more about how we can see the world the way Jesus does? Just what are some maybe practical steps to begin to frame the world the way Jesus does? I think that would be helpful.
Well, I think, again, a huge part of it is like reading the scriptures, understanding what God's heart is. Like cultures tend towards favoring the rich, the powerful, the beautiful, the wealthy. This is just like the way that cultures work. And if we're discipled by the culture, and it's primarily, to me, around attention. There is a war for your attention. And if we just let the culture tell us what to pay attention to, we will never see the way Jesus sees. And that's why it's very, very important, the sort of like sensational media and the traumatic news we let define our sense of sight. And then I think one practice, which may seem very, very counterintuitive, it's a discipline in my life, is what I just call walking slowly through the city. And it often amazes me that Jesus, sensitive to the Spirit, is willing to just stop and minister to somebody, to just have a conversation and just to talk to them. And you just never know what it does. Yesterday, I personally witnessed a hate crime. And the police were called, but they showed up way too late. And I just felt so powerless in the situation to do anything about it, except this young African-American woman who was on the receiving end of it. I just was like, I don't know what to do here. But I had space and I had margin. So I just asked the Holy Spirit and I just went up to her, and in a non-weird way, I just tried to cancel the words that were spoken over her by declaring a different reality about her. And it's like, look, yesterday we had church. Thousands of people watched our church. It was probably high quality producing, and I got a lot of meetings done, did a lot of coaching yesterday. But as I was doing the prayer of examine and reflecting on my day yesterday, it was like that moment of talking to that woman in her pain and trying to bring healing after she'd experienced trauma. That was the Jesus moment. That was the moment where the kingdom of God touched someone in the city of New York beyond a sermon, beyond formal religious programming. So to me, walk slowly, pay attention. Learn to have the margin to see. Ask God to highlight people to you. Jesus, who is there that you want to minister to today? Slow down. See.
Yeah, that's such a challenge. We're such a busy culture, and I imagine New York is, very, very busy too. And then, thinking of Acts 3, where John and Peter are walking to the temple, and he's doing exactly that. Peter's looking for, God to be a work in my life and in the work of others through me. And that's a great challenge. I hadn't thought about just slowing down and giving margin. So that's actually a kind of spiritual discipline, perhaps, for busy people.
Yes. We are often in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the busy Levite crossing the road to get to our formless religion. Like we don't want to be, and we know we shouldn't be. We often are.
Yeah, that's really good. All right. Okay. So one last question. Does Jesus rescue everyone? So that's your thoughts.
Jesus rescues everyone who wants to be rescued.
Good.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a universalist.
Yep.
I believe it violates the principles of free will. I mean, the invitation is open to all, but not everybody's interested. Not everybody's interested in the invitation. I think we need to respect human dignity and human agency that's connected to this.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, good. So we're just about done. Man, this is so. I think what this is doing in my heart, just listening to you in these three, it's just sort of recalibrating and reminding me that it's about Jesus, and that
Yeah.
and maybe it's just the conviction to spend time in the Gospels. I think it's easier for me sometimes to do the more teaching passages and like a Philippians or Romans, but like I need to just immerse myself in the world of Jesus and then allow that to sort of change me. So this is really, really helpful. Okay, well, any last words, John, from you, and we can wrap this up. But thank you so much for this. This has been excellent.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would say, it's similar to you, is stay in the Gospels, never leave the Gospels. It would be this: look, we are not called by God to defend the white evangelical church. We are not called by God to make America the kingdom of heaven on earth. We are called by God to be loyal, sacrificial, loving disciples of Jesus. Do not let anything distract you from that. That is the first principle, the first priority. We have been predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son. Your life mission is to become like Christ and to extend his love in the world. Keep that at the center and you will stay sane in the midst of this religious chaos.
Well, excellent last words. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Okay, wow, this is great. So I know that there's been some that have been emailing wanting to know if we have, if these will be posted. We're going to post all 4 of the lectures at the end of the month on the Mars Hill Exchange website. So don't worry, you'll be able to access these and there'll be emails that are coming out. So John, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you're a busy man. I know you, I'm glad to hear you give yourself margin in the busyness. And that's a real good word, I think, to all of us. But thank you for the time, and I'm looking forward to next week. We're just going to continue on. We'll have Dr. Timothy Gombis, who's a New Testament scholar, actually, and he's going to talk to us about a passage in Ephesians and kingdom virtues in this world. And so I'm looking forward to that. So we'll see you all next week, same time, same place. Blessings to you, John. Blessings to you.
No worries. Thanks. Grace and peace, everybody.
Thanks so much. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.